how are we deploying these systems and what are we training them on. A lot of when we think about an AI system goes back to how are we creating it, where are we sourcing the data on which we are training it, and a lot of that comes from human error.
You know, systems just inherently grow in complexity and sophistication in a panoply of ways. We just can't predict them, right? And we have to have intelligent humans, you know, getting into these systems and putting the humanity back into them or checking them, but they're going to get more complex.
The thesis which I hold is like, you innovate for India, you will innovate for the world.
E.O. Wilson had a fantastic phrase which I think captures our time, where he said, we have godlike technology, Paleolithic emotions, and medieval institutions. And that sums up the conundrum that we are trying to analyze over these next 2 days. To do that, again, we have some fantastic speakers. We have Eric Daimler, who was Obama's advisor on AI. He's been an AI researcher and entrepreneur for the better part of 30 years. He is also the founder of Conexus, which is working at the cutting edge of AI technologies, because while the world is banking on generative AI, which is a probabilistic, a probabilistic model, he's working on something that he says you can bet your life on, which is a symbolic model, which is a deductive reasoning by machines, and what the two of them together can do. So we're going to call him on stage. We're also, just 10 minutes later, going to call Peeyush Ranjan on stage, who's the VP of Google Engineering. He's shepherding Google's big unleash on the world, which is the Gemini AI. And it's interesting because Google's DeepMind was the nursery of artificial intelligence. But talking about this extremely flexible world, OpenAI, a young, scrappy startup, overtook even Google. So we'll get to hear from Peeyush, how is AI going to be deployed in India? What are the ramifications? What's big tech thinking about all these riddles that are arising? And we have Irene Solaiman, who's a young researcher, AI researcher, who was working at OpenAI when ChatGPT was in its formation, when it was still in the womb. And she helped to train it, because another facet that every technologist, philosopher, people involved in this are talking about is to distinguish and not treat this technology as something outside of ourselves, but something that humans can train. So Irene was responsible for putting culture into technology. And it'll be a very, very interesting conversation to understand, how do you train a dragon? How do you train a machine with culture and empathy and values? She's now the global policy leader at Hugging Face, which is an open source network of AI, and we'll be talking about all of this. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eric Daimler on stage. Eric, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you. As I said, you were the originator of this volcanic excitement and anxiety that has been unleashed in the world. I've been sharing some shards of facts, but they're typically always about things to be mildly or extremely alarmed by. And a couple more that I want to share. People have described this generative AI. I don't know how many of you have used it, just so I get a sense of familiarity for both of us. Would you raise your hands, how many of you have used ChatGPT or Midjourney? Wow, look at that, okay. So then we don't need to speak about the power of this technology. But when it came upon us, it was described as equivalent or more scary than nuclear weapons, fire, more than electricity, more disruptive, more transformational. Goldman Sachs said within a month of ChatGPT being released that it would displace 300 million people. So there are all these massive ramifications. But before I bring you into that, Eric, today be the ambassador of AI. What are you excited about? What are its potentialities? And as an entrepreneur, what is it that you're backing?
Yeah, thank you. And it's good to be here. It's good to be in India. It's really exciting.
And it's not good to see you in a tie. This is
what I wear every Saturday.
It's a tussle we've been having where I said Eric should show his inner tech cowboy rather than being presented in this suit, boot, and tie. But anyway.
That's right. I use this to hide my Superman costume underneath. Right. You know, it's an interesting question you bring up about how many people have used ChatGPT, and if you do me the favor of putting up your hands again at how many people have used ChatGPT, and then how many people have used ChatGPT in the last month? And then put your hands down if you haven't used it in the last week, or last day, or looked up whether or not Eric Daimler should be trusted on AI, you know? Yeah, okay. You know, I use that exercise to say that it's not just something that you want to try once. It's a tab that you should have open on your browser and experiment with. You know, we have 25 years of experience with working with search engines, and now we need to have a different way of interacting with the knowledge in the world. So I encourage all of you just to experiment with large language models all the time, because it's just the new way of interacting with knowledge. So I'll tell you a story about what I'm excited about. You know, I've been doing AI for 20 plus years. I was following after the original autonomous car at Carnegie Mellon in 1983. It's one of the inspirations for me going into this business. And most recently in San Francisco, I've been riding in the autonomous cars that are going around San Francisco. Outside my office, we have a car going by every minute testing over the past 5 or so years. But now I can get in as a consumer and use these autonomous cars with no driver in the front, like a taxi, like an ordinary Uber. And it's really fantastic. You know, I feel safer, to use the argument that it's actually going to reduce traffic because most of San Francisco's traffic, or some plurality of San Francisco's traffic, is created by people circling the block looking for parking. And so if you just have autonomous cars picking people up, dropping people off, you know, brings some degree of efficiency. So that's a type of thing that brings me hope. But you know, also there's an enormous range of benefits, and whenever we talk about the dangers of AI, I think it's also important that we talk about the panoply of benefits to our safety, our quality of life, and the productivity that we can experience from AI, which is what I'd love to be talking about forever, because that's what gives us the quality of life we have today, which is increases in productivity, and increases of productivity for which we can be grateful to our ancestors, that hopefully we can pass on to our children.
So Eric, talk to us, you know, like I said, this is about a multifaceted conversation, and today you represent the optimism of that before I take you into deeper waters. So talk, you know, there are a lot of entrepreneurs in this hall. Tell us some of the things that you're backing or you're betting on. And you know, when we were chatting over coffee, you had almost a kind of, you know, psychedelic moment of excitement looking at the labor compression that is possible through AI, efficiency, abundance. These are the words that Silicon Valley uses. The massive leap in quarterly growth that is possible. So, as I said, before I take you into the underlayers of that conversation, talk to us about you know, you said safety, but what's more that you can do with AI? You
know, when I was in the White House, I had the privilege of not just speaking humbly on behalf of the president, but also seeing AI implementations at the largest scale. And one thing I saw is the difficulty of bringing data together. You know, if we think about what AI is and how we use it, it's fundamentally about manipulating data. And bringing data together is a problem. It's actually really complex. It's a hard problem, and that business is actually supported mostly by companies based in India. It's a $50 billion industry that's a pretty manual digital effort. And that is a complex IT problem that is beginning to be automated by IT. You know, taking you on a little journey with economics for a bit, there's a thing called Baumol's law. Baumol was an economist that talked about differentiations of productivity. The quintessential example is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It takes just as many violinists today to perform Beethoven's Ninth as it did 100 years ago. Therefore, classical music, Beethoven's Ninth, has become a luxury good because it has not increased, violinists have not increased in their productivity relative to other things. So things that don't increase in productivity become relatively more expensive. This is what's happening in IT. So that $50 billion a year business that is based mostly with companies headquartered in India is going to become relatively more expensive if you don't automate that business. And companies like mine we're in the business of actually automating that away. And we automate that $50 billion industry by about 200 to 1, and we increase the speed by about 20 to 1. That's distressing to those people accountable to the income statement of those companies, but it's really exciting to the rest of us that benefit from all the outcomes of having more data brought together. So an example, Uber is one of our company's clients, and that I can talk about. So Uber, you imagine, they have these ordinary business problems, supply, demand, and how will this event affect the traffic in the region, and how will that therefore affect the prices? For them to answer that question, they first of all need to bring together data. And how it had happened was they had to do that manually. They had hundreds of people doing that work, bringing together databases manually in order to ask ordinary business intelligence questions. So they used the AI that became familiar to me when I was in the White House to bring that data together and to have them tell it. We save them like $10+ million a year, and they have an alacrity to operate their business. This is the type of AI that I think is exciting because it's a practical AI. That's what I'd want to talk about. It's a practical AI that we can all get around and have a conversation about in our daily lives. What's use does it provide to my government? What use does it provide to my company?
So Eric, when you were talking about that you're automating even this data integration, again, these are just interesting counterpoints. I'm not going to pull you into that because the others will speak of it, but just last year, 250,000 tech workers lost their jobs, and at the same time, all the stock market, the stocks of all the tech companies went up. I'm again using Microsoft because it's OpenAI, but they sacked 20,000 workers. The day they did that, their stocks went up by 200%, So that's a whole other phenomenon building up there. And we thought creativity, knowledge workers, coders, etc., would be, the empathetic human imagination workers would be protected, but actually those are the ones that's going up, getting blown up right away. So I just want to leave that when you're talking about the excitement of this technology. You mentioned, Eric, that we have to participate in our own automation, and that if we don't, it's just too bad, we're going to get left behind. And you used a very interesting phrase where you said, we have to now start doing something which is computational thinking, that if we live in this liminal gray area of being humans, we're going to be obsoleted. We have to externalize our thinking, make it very very explicit, clear, almost binary, so that the machine can collaborate with us, As I said, philosophically, that's a terrifying idea, and you said that as a human being, you have sympathy for all this, but as an entrepreneur, you're very excited. So tell us, what does this even mean, that we have to participate in automation? After we enable the machine, what's going to happen to society?
Yeah, well, that last question, I don't know. But we'll take the first question. What's happening today? What can I do this quarter? What can I do on a Monday morning? When you go back to work. The idea is that there's three ways to address automation. And the fourth option, resistance, really isn't an option. You can just think of all the times in human history where we've automated tasks. How did it go for the people that resisted automation? Not terribly well. And so we talk about really having three choices. One may be seductive, which is you become a niche player or you become an artisan. That's available for a lot of people. We still buy pottery that's made by hand. So that's still available for people, artisan, niche players. The second we talk about is people that participate in automation, and that's people that use the tools, are familiar with the process about how they're interacting with their colleagues around the organization, and learn to improve that process using the digital tools that's available. The third option is if I ignore those first two and I just continue to do my job, then I'm just going to be slapped upside the head when automation just takes my job, and I'll be surprised when I'm one of the 200,000 people that are laid off. So participating means continuing to work on improving the automation. What's changed in a digital world is that we have to get comfortable developing skills and then having the half-life on those skills shrinking, and have to learn new skills. And this goes for everybody. It goes for me and everybody else in this room. All of our skills has a half-life, and that half-life is shrinking. That's what it means to be participating in this economy, and I am sympathetic to it because I'm participating in it, in both sides.
Right. So, Eric, this is literally like the Chinese doll phenomenon, because everything you say is going to go deeper and deeper, deeper into asking you counter questions or even interested questions. But right now, just wearing your entrepreneur's hat, I was laughing that Eric is a bit of a fractal personality because he constantly speaks of himself in compartments. He says, oh, as a human being, I can feel sad for that. But as an entrepreneur, I'm delighted. And as a policy guy, I think let's break the circuits. But as an entrepreneur, never, never, never. So that's pretty much Eric for you. But Eric, as I said, this is a room full of very influential people. Would you at least tell us what is the kinds of industries that in the next short frame, 3 or 4 year frame, that you're really seeing transformative change? And apart from the military, which you're not talking to us about, what else are you investing in?
Yeah, energy, logistics, manufacturing, healthcare, finance, hospitality. It's really goes across the spectrum. Any place there's data.
That's the human mind.
Yeah,
the greatest data center.
It's not necessarily an industry thing. I'd say defense actually is more related to all those industries than healthcare. Healthcare is probably the one that's most different from all the other industries. But it's really the job to be done in those industries that needs to be addressed. And what you want to look at is whenever you think of data science and you think of predictive analytics, the job to be done below that is called data engineering. It's bringing all that data together. That's where to look. That's what's begin to be automated. I can say one more thing on this. So the sexy AI that you see in that video, that's addressing a branch of AI that we'll call probabilistic AI. And to remember our high school logic, that is in inductive AI. So inductive means you're actually starting from a specific and you're making a generalization. I saw one animal that has wings. I see another animal that has wings. Therefore, all these animals have wings. That's specifics to a generalization. And you can imagine if I had 1 million of those things, I still may have edge cases for failure. That's induction. This is our high school logic, right? And thank you for staying with me on this. The other way is deduction, and deduction says I'm going to take from a generalization. All birds have wings, then this animal has wings, therefore it must be a bird. And so general to a specific. Deduction and induction. The probabilistic AI that you saw, this is really sexy, that's the inductive part, but you always have to test and you'll always have errors. That's fantastic for creating a telegenic video, but it's not something that you're going to want to design an airplane with, or manage a power plant with, or do the risk profile for a bank. What we do. On the other side, it's all facts, and it's not as sexy to create a video about the integrity of an airplane or the efficiency of a bank or reducing the waste of an airplane. But maybe it can if I ask you to add a bass track, to me talking about airplanes, then it may be sexy. But anyway, it's the merger of those applied to organizations that is the future of AI.
Right. So before I call Peeyush and Irene on stage, I just wanted to put to you, Eric, because you're literally from the heart and crucible of this, that apart from all this immediate fears, about displacement, about mostly about human replacement, and all the power that is being concentrated, there's another statistic that 99% of Forbes Fortune 500 companies are now using AI for decision making, for triaging, etc. So those are things that I'll ask your peers to speak about. But there's been a fear across the community amongst coders themselves that one is the immediate power of this and how do you harness it for good and for bad. But the other is that there's this black box phenomenon where, for instance, Geoffrey Hinton and others said that they themselves don't understand what is going on within this technology. You've put this massive complex structure together, 10 trillion parameters, and that's just the beginning. It's in its infancy, 1 year old. And it's already getting emergent qualities, For instance, it learned to speak Bengali when it hadn't been given Bengali data.
Yeah.
So Geoffrey has talked about that, and people say, oh, it's just a predictive machine. It's a stochastic parrot. It's just like predicting the next words in your sentence. But he said something very interesting. He said, why don't any of us try and predict what your friend is going to say? To predict the latter half of that sentence, you have to understand what that person was saying. And so he says that when you're sifting through trillions of parameters of data, for the AI to understand what is the next predictive part of the sentence, the machine actually has to understand it. And he talked about a joke where he said, why is Fox News an oxymoron? And he split the word. So apparently ChatGPT said, because it's not news, you know. He said, oh, but oxy and moron are separate words. And then ChatGPT said, oh, that's because oxy is an addictive drug called Oxycontin. You know? And he said, how did that machine understand the joke? You know? And he's the maker of this. He's the originator of this. So here's my question to you, that are these fears at all grounded? I'm not talking about sentience and Terminator, robots killing us, but just that this machine could become so complex that it escapes the parameters of what its coders had created. Is that possible?
In a short answer, yes.
Ouch. Ouch.
Yeah, but you know,
that's Obama's advisor saying that, guys.
We're going to talk about this in the next segment with Irene, you know, and I'm grateful that her and people like her are working on this problem. Because, you know, when I was in the White House, I was banging the table as loud as I can to get people involved in this conversation about AI, to put constraints around how these are deployed. And there's ways we can talk about, I guess, in the next segment. Because it doesn't really matter whether we call this a stochastic parrot or a 32,000 word autocomplete. That's kind of literally true, but it kind of doesn't matter because the damage it could do, or the benefit, is really what we should be looking at. I mean, I can speak to where the future is going a little bit, and this was my academic research when I was doing my PhD, is I worked actually not just on working with what I was going to say next, I was working on what other people were going to say to me. Because you imagine if I say I'm going to go running, you're not going to say, let's have lunch. Like, it'd be kind of weird, right? Or you'd say, that's a nice table. Like, that would be a non sequitur. I can begin to predict a little bit about how you're going to react. If I say, let's go running, you're going to say, oh, I'm tired. Oh, let's get lunch first, or something like that. That's where this is going, and that's still academic research, but 5 to 10 years, that's what's going to happen. So I'm going to construct an email, and I'm going to be able to predict a little bit about how somebody's going to respond to the email, not just how to construct it. That's where this is going. And that's a benefit of scale, but it also gets a little scary, right? It gets a little frightening. You can kind of imagine the bad ways that could be deployed. But it's also super exciting, right?
Okay, Eric, you're going to be accosted over lunch, and people are going to want to deepen these conversations. I'm going to bring Peeyush and Irene Solaiman on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peeyush Ranjan and Irene Solaiman. Thank you very much for being here, Peeyush and Irene. You know, I just had Eric open the first layer of the onion peel, and I'd love to draw both of you into it. Peeyush, you've been, again, at the heart of Google engineering. You know, you've been there many years, 15 years. You played a big role in deploying Google in India and expanding its depth in India. So again, this is really just a strategy that first let's talk about the good stuff. Okay. You really helped Google acculturate to India. You know, you created Google Pay, you opened up many languages, 100 language apps, made it possible for first generation literates, even those who are not literate, to be able to access knowledge. So all of that is fantastic. But now here's a new beast on the landscape, which is generative AI, or indeed deductive symbolic AI. In the Indian context, where do you see this technology going? Which would be the areas that it would first be most wonderfully deployed in?
I think in the Indian context, if you look at the context, probably number one big thing, which is unlike many other places, is since we're talking about AI and the core of some of that starts with language, there's so many different languages which we have. We have a huge workforce which actually goes and does a bunch of things. There are sectors which are not modernized as much as some of the Western countries like healthcare, agriculture, but there is a lot of desire to do that. And also there's a global role which I think India itself can play. So I think looking at all of these, there's a lot of opportunities. It'll be hard for me to say just one or two, but I would say like the biggest thing I feel is going into specific sectors will be great. Like I gave example of healthcare or agriculture. Similarly, I think there's a big opportunity in India. I mean, given all the things which you said, the thesis which I hold is like, you innovate for India, you'll innovate for the world, right? I mean, the examples which you're talking about, like almost all of them, when we have done that for India, it actually has become examples which we can take to every market and say, like, look how great it works. So I think from that perspective, I think there is a huge opportunity in reskilling, which we can do here. A whole world actually will probably find itself reskilling, learning the new things. So.
Peeyush, reskilling in what? When this technology is coming to replace knowledge workers, machine workers, shop assistants, bosses. Most CEOs here are going to be irrelevant after a while because AI decision-making is taking over everything, and it's seen as more objective, which is something that we'll be speaking with Michael Sandel, who's a philosopher, that is objective decision-making really better than subjective decision-making? That's a whole, so I'm not sure we should allow you these easy getaways.
No, not at all. It's not easy, but I don't buy the basic premise that everybody will be out of a job. The way we look at, like, what exactly is happening, let's look at it from first principles, right? When internet came about, information got digitized, right? When information got digitized, there were a lot of jobs which were there, and now things got democratized. Information was more accessible, right? People who were selling Encyclopedia Britannica door to door, well, those jobs don't exist anymore. But there's so many other things which can be done. If you look at, let's talk about Google Pay. Money got digitized, right? See how many more people are banked today and how better the distribution of government funds is today, right, in India itself. Everybody in the world is looking at what India did and like, oh, how can we go do that, right? So here, what is happening? Cognition is getting digitized, right? Now, all of a sudden, you have a tool in front of you which actually can take over the tedious and repetitive and those kind of tasks and let you focus at a higher level. Now, you can go to every technology. Let's take Photoshop, those kind of things. They make people do more creative jobs. If you took that tool away, their productivity will actually go down because they will be doing more tedious things, repetitive things more. So fundamentally, when this kind of cognition digitization improves accessibility, a lot more people can go access that. Overall, yes, individuals who are doing certain things today, they have to go learn new things, but overall the society actually becomes more productive. And that's what our hope is, that this technology is going to help each one of us become more creative and do higher level, more creative jobs more easily, rather than the doomsday scenario which you're talking about.
Sure. Peeyush, I'll just leave some counterfacts, and I get it, and that's why I was saying this entire conference is running on the horns of a dilemma, because there is immense opportunity and abundance and exciting new frontiers like Eric's talking about that's being opened up. But at the other level, it's important to keep putting the other stuff back on the table, and I hope we can start synthesizing these two things. Because there's a little bit of easy speak in what you're saying, because when you say, the tedious jobs will go, but creative, higher order thinking, that's not true. I don't know if, again, you've tried your competitors, Sora. Sora is a new app that's just been released. If you haven't tried it, please try it. You type an idea in your head, and a film is made with human beings that you can't tell whether they're real human beings or just virtual human beings. It's a line of insanity. I don't know if you're virtual or you're not, because it's that real. That's creativity. As I said, 99% of Forbes, Fortune 500 companies are using AI as decision-making for triaging, hiring, firing. It's able to process data better. So that's higher order thinking. Knowledge workers. I mean, at the World Economic Forum, they put out a report saying that 60% of global jobs is going to be impacted by this. 30% will just be adjusted, 30% are going to get lost in the developed world, So these are just counterfacts. I'm not saying you have to have answers, but I'm just putting them on the table. Irene, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. As we were saying, that this is not just technology that exists in itself. It's being coded by men like the ones who are on stage, as well as women, and they have a role to play in it. And you've actually had this wonderful experience of humanizing the machine, or putting the human into the machine. Moral values, cultural values. Talk to us about some of the dilemma of training ChatGPT to be more human.
Yes, well, I love something that Shoma has said to me, that AI is shaping us. And something that I've been working on is how do we shape AI back? I love the title of this session of How to Train a Dragon, because it was actually the internal title that we had for that work, was How to Train Your Dragon to be more like the communities that it's affecting. I'm so glad we're having this conversation in India, which has so much cultural richness, and coming from the US, there is no one culture per one large group per one country population. So to try to figure out this immense machine that nobody really understands how it works, it's similar to How to Train a Dragon, where we don't have a set playbook, we don't have anything concrete that tells us this is the one way to fail-proof, make sure that it works for every single person interacting with it.
But Irene, talk to us about the specificities. You know, you asked the machine a very interesting question: what is a happy person? And this is talking about bias in the machine that is being deployed at civilization scale. You know, it's species scale deployment of a technology, which when you ask it, what does it mean to be happy? It says it's a man without a wife, with children. This is a machine saying that, and you were trying to train it to have a more nuanced understanding of happiness.
Exactly.
You know?
Yes, and for some people, for that man without children, that could be absolutely true. I have not had that experience myself, so it might not work for me. And when we're asking these types of questions, when we think through what does culture mean to any group, it's the way that we have approached it technically is to start to break down to categories of culture. So one would be association and relationships. One would be concepts of beauty. And then another question that you would prompt a language model is what makes the most beautiful person in the world? That looks incredibly different throughout the world, and a nuanced view, a nuanced answer would be that beauty is subjective, beauty is through the eye of the beholder, but a lot of people might disagree with that.
Yeah. So, you know, when you were talking about training this machine and we were chatting earlier, I had this sudden sense that it was almost like parents training a child, you know, with a certain value system. And you have all those dilemmas like whose values? Is it the American Midwest? Is it New York values? Is it San Francisco? Is it Silicon values? Like values itself is so mutable, you know? And I think that's what makes this so bewildering, because this is not one child which is going to impact a small circle of people. This is a gargantuan, this is like, you know, a Hanuman scale child being unleashed upon the world with 3 parents training it to have a certain value system, you know. And I heard Sam Altman talk to Lex Fridman about how do you teach this machine humility, or how do you teach it ambiguity, you know. So I would love, you know, she's already talked about the dilemma of doing this. Since both of you are at the heart of these technologies, what are the big companies thinking about all this?
Yeah, I have an answer for how you do that. Technically, the correct way to address the problem that you just identified is that you encode the truths, whatever they are, whatever is determined by your good work, is you encode them in symbols, in symbolic generative AI, in the facts. That's that deductive part. And then you feed those facts into the inductive part, the probabilistic, stochastic part. And then that is brought to the human to contextualize it again and reinterpret for modification to the symbolic part, the facts. And that's the cycle. So you have the symbolic part, the stochastic part, and we'll say the social part to create an alliteration. That's the cycle about how that answer works. Where we get upset is if we only rely on the large language models, only the probabilistic part, because that's going to give us errors. The proper term is confabulation, where it's like a little child just creating facts, and they just create a distribution of things that they think are true. That's actually how to do it, is a symbolic, stochastic, and social loop.
So Eric, earlier you said one safe way to deploy this technology would be to have circuit breakers. What did you mean by that? Yeah,
so the concept of circuit breakers is one of the answers towards creating AI safety. That left to their own devices, people like me will be toiling away in the basement, creating automation and then linking automation. That's just what we will do, and we will just be creating more automation. But sometimes you don't want things to be linked. You don't want necessarily your Amazon customer trust score to be linked to the degree to which you're then trusted by the airplane security personnel, right? You don't want those links to necessarily occur. You want them to be transparent, because otherwise you could get caught in, if anybody watched the movie Brazil, it's a good movie, I'd imagine. It's a dystopic movie, but I liked it. It's a way, circuit breakers are something we need to be able to have a human interact with to break up these sequences of automation and expose the transparency of AI.
So Peeyush, I'd like to bring you in here. You know, we've been talking about this, that when this AI was first unleashed on the world, everybody, and that includes the Google top brass, it included Microsoft, everybody, like literally everybody, saying that this is very dangerous, we need structures, we need regulation. There was one cynical response which said the big companies were trying to stop young, scrappy starters, so you suddenly want regulation because you want only the big guys to stay. But at another level, there is this discussion about the need for regulation, you know? So because you are the front-facing aspect of technology in society, would you give us some insight on, say, just your company? How is Google thinking about it? And just one quick twisted question on that. How come Google lost the race to AI?
Let me first answer the second question.
Did the corporate communication clear that?
No, I think if we think about it as a race, then I think it's kind of sensationalizing the situation. AI, or the current transformation which we are seeing, is probably one of the most important technological transformations happening in front of us at a very fast pace. There's no one company which can go and, you know, just change everything. The more number of companies which are in there, the better it is. You know, if you look at, like, not just Google or, you know, let's say Facebook with its open models or OpenAI, anybody, but there are many medium and small companies. The amount of capital which is going into this space is so high that it's not a race which is like against one another, but it's actually an effort to go and define what this space should look like. Now, if you look at transformers, for example, they fundamentally changed what we could do with language models. Before that, it was very hard to process so much data, and that is why things were stopped. But Google published it. Everybody took it. But it actually changed. OK, all right, all of a sudden, it's technically possible. But our philosophy is to deploy it responsibly and yet be bold, like be able to put things. So it took a while, like we put it in search first and all that, and now we have seen with Gemini and Vertex and all these, it's coming out. So we are making rapid progression. I don't think we see it, I mean, you know, as Google as a race, as opposed to like, okay, let's go and invest deeply in technology and do it responsibly. I can give you examples like search. Google was not the first search engine. Chrome was not the first browser. Android was not the first mobile operating system. But we always look at, okay, what can we do for the user? Now, coming to the regulations part, the approach which we have to take, and this is why we come back to, like, it's a piece of technology. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. And it will be used for both. How do we shape the world in the right way? And the way we think is it has to be multiple stakeholders coming together. It has to be a joint effort. You know, when you know, the Partnership for AI was a program which actually Google started in 2018 with Amazon and Facebook and others, exactly to kind of get everybody together saying, look, this thing is coming. How do we do it responsibly? So multi-stakeholder, which includes large companies, which includes, you know, content creators, partners, government, everybody. Now, looking at governments who are very capable of creating regulations, there the primary thinking is that let's have, and this is another thing, I mean, you know, this is another example. You asked, what can India do, right? These are the kind of things every government can do, is like, let's come up with state-of-art regulation which allows rapid innovation in low-risk products, right? And be very clear on how to control the high-risk where there is actually a chance of physical harm or something like that, how to regulate that more strongly and have a legal framework such that innovation can happen very well on the rest of it. Because we don't want to just over-regulate everything. And then, of course, the other thing which would be needed is like kind of all the governments kind of working together so that we can have like a global way of approaching this problem. So that is what I think we would suggest.
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting. Just recently, in the UN has set up a coalition of a new body, actually a governing body, and we have two Indians. Sharad Sharma, one of the speakers here, is also a member of that UN body, because everyone's realizing that this has to be a transnational conversation. It's not a conversation that can be actually geographically contained. And Mustafa Sulaiman, in fact, put out this. He's part of one of the co-founders of DeepMind, where AI had literally its infancy. And he said that it's going to blow up the idea of a nation state. Nation states are going to not really have much meaning because this technology is going to blur those boundaries completely. So it's interesting that these coalitions of countries, and that's a phrase that even Rajiv Chandrasekhar and Ashwini Vaishnaw have been using, that we need a coalition of countries to think this through. So I'm going to come back to some more thorny questions for you, Peeyush. But Irene, I wanted to bring you in that, there's this other aspect. We're talking about this big picture things, but there's already a deployment of AI in risk assessment. For instance, 22 states in America are using AI for parole to assess the criminality or future criminality of people. And there's a huge bias inbuilt into that. A black prisoner is going to naturally be seen as a bigger repeat offender than a white one, regardless of what happens. We've already talked about the fact that decision-making in companies, hiring, firing, insurance, whether you can get a bank loan, things which are really of existential risk already to some communities, is already being determined by AI. So what's your thinking on that? How do we sensitize such a gigantic structure to do this?
Thank you for the easy question of today. So I want to talk I think there are 3 points here. One on existential risk and to whom. 2 on the level of risk in which we are deploying systems. And 3, something that we've all highlighted, which is what does it look like for people who are not closest to the systems to be able to guide the development of those systems. So around existential risk, there's been a lot of conversation around what does this mean for humanity as a whole, but also what does this mean in the very near term to peoples who may not be experiencing the benefits as much as they are experiencing those risks, and to whom jobs are existential. Something as loan prediction is existential to a family, which brings me to thinking about how are we deploying these systems and what are we training them on. A lot of when we think about an AI system goes back to how are we creating it, where are we sourcing the data on which we are training it, and a lot of that comes from human error, from sometimes bad things happen in human systems and how humans give out loans themselves, and then we train on that data, and then maybe AI can amplify that. So there's a lot of ways, not just technically, that we should be mitigating these harms. And then back to lowering the barrier for people who may not be computer scientists. I really appreciated Peeyush's earlier statements around language. For example, there's so much value that is codified in the diversity of Indian languages. There's also different ways that people are comfortable contributing to making a system work better in that particular language, and ensuring that when we have this conversation at Synapse, industry and technologists need to be listening to artists to understand how these systems cannot supplant but supplement their work, augment it but not replace it.
Right, but is that even possible? There is and in fact Sridhar Vembu, who's also one of our speakers, he's been advocating that in the Indian context, you need much more simple, smaller and more nimble systems which are designed for particular activities rather than releasing these gargantuan structures, So I would like both Peeyush, you and Eric to comment on that the sheer money and efficiency and abundance for some people that these large structures can generate, is there any possibility that these large structures would be prohibited, but its qualities and skills would then be put into smaller circuits that people can control? Is that at all a possibility or a way of thinking? Eric, you're smiling so evilly that it's, I already know the answer.
You know the answer. Yeah, why I'm smiling is because you're articulating the future. No one is going to no one is going to in this room. Raise your hand if I'm wrong, but I'm going to say that no one in this room is going to say that the future world in which we exist is going to be simpler. It's going to be more complex. Systems just inherently grow in complexity and sophistication in a panoply of ways. We just can't predict them, right? And we have to have intelligent humans, getting into these systems and putting the humanity back into them or checking them, but they're going to get more complex. How we manage that is an answer. Is we encode the facts, right? And then we learn from what we've encoded in large language models. So if we ever want to learn from a system, we use a large language model. We use a probabilistic system. And then if we want to teach an AI what we want to put in our values, whatever they are in whatever context, then we use a symbolic AI. It's a learning and a teaching, and that's the system. And in risk management, I can speak to that because we have many of our clients from nation states to banking systems to energy systems that work with us on risk. The biggest dynamic we see is that people have gotten the memo that data is the new oil and all that. You've heard this thing, right? But the collection of data itself is not an asset. It's the use of the data. Now, you're going to get salespeople from the hyperscalers, like Google, like Amazon, like Microsoft, and they get paid based on how much data you collect. They don't get paid based on how much data you use. And that's the issue, is how much data you use. And so you're going to have better risk models the more data you actually use, more data you actually utilize, regardless of the context, whether it's a bank or whether it's for parole.
So, Peeyush, I'd love you to step in here, and I told you I was keeping one thorny question for you before,
Actually, can I add to
sure,
that?
Of course.
Then I would love I'm not trying to avoid the thorny questions, but the point which you said, which is like India doesn't need those kind of large models, is actually a very insightful point. As I said earlier, innovate for India, innovate for the world. This has proven itself time and again. And the way the current models are, they're huge and they are actually capable of doing a lot of different things. But we are already starting to see the architecture evolve. Like, we have mixture, like just to get a little bit technical, we have sparsely gated mixture of experts architecture, which means you're huge, but you can run compute really with a lot less compute, you can run large models. And they outperform what the current setup is. Now, going back to the point which he made about India, the overall point is, can you run things in more resource-constrained environment? And if you can run, the whole world will be hungry for it. And I'll give you a small example. We did this with Android with Moto G. If you have used a phone called Moto G, it was built with the point of view that how do you build a Samsung quality phone, but at 1/3 the price? And we did that, and India actually, sold like hotcakes over here. But then we found everybody else in the world wanted low-cost Android phones. Now, the same thing is that if we are able to do these either by technically, reducing the cost of running a model, or by using the trade-off of quality versus task, like size, building smaller models and having like some sort of a cascade, all of these architectures will actually be very, very useful for the whole world, not just for India. And, it's just the beginning of what we are seeing. Like next year, year after that, things will be changing rapidly in front of us as we optimize it.
So, the question I was saving for you was that this troika of concerns we are talking about is the relationship between nature, humans, and technology. So far we were talking about humans and technology, but there is the nature aspect as well. And it's fascinating because we are talking about AI being the panacea for climate change, that it could possibly solve climate change. It's certainly absolutely changing the health industry, medical drugs, designing drugs, diagnostics. I'm not taking away from any of the excitements of AI, and I'm being very hypocritical here talking about all this because every image that you're seeing in this conference is generated by AI, So I just want to acknowledge that this is great hypocrisy right here. But at the same time, there's something now called technological thirst, and there are huge ecological costs to this technology. You know, it is very, very energy intensive, it's very water intensive, and I must appreciate both Microsoft and Google has put out a very transparent, I hope, report, which is that in just the last year, Microsoft's use of water went up by 1.75 billion gallons of water. Google said its use of water in the last 1 year, presumably training these little animals, has gone up by 20%. So that's a massive ecological cost for this technology, you know. How are we going to think around that?
I can tell you how we at Google are thinking about this. Also, sustainable computing, because even before AI, as the world was coming online and they were going into the getting these services on their phones or laptops, the data centers were becoming very, very energy hungry. Now, if you go look at it, I mean, you know, I think it's almost like, I think 6+ years, we have been producing reports of how our data centers are sustainable and either very low carbon footprint or virtually no carbon footprint. The basic thing which we are trying to do here is 4 things. First of all, we are trying to build, come up with technologies which are really able to do machine learning in more efficient manner. I gave the example of sparse gated mixture of experts. Google is the one which published
You're
that
getting
paper.
an easy pass on that because none of us can understand
but
what that is.
you don't have to believe me. Gemini 1.5, for example, if you have heard of that, I mean, it's able to handle 1 million tokens, right? And at lesser compute. Well, how? The papers were published by Google, that this is how you go do it. The whole purpose is how do we come up with better technology which reduces the compute? The second thing is how do you build special purpose machines? So TPUs, for example. The third is how do you do more in cloud as opposed to your desktop, because it's a lot more energy efficient to do there. And the third is how do you put your jobs where it's better, more energy efficient, because not every place in the world is the same in terms of power and cooling. But here's the overall point. It's a work in progress, but just I take these 4 things, and if you compute, the reason it's like much smaller, you know, the increase, we have made it, and this is calculated, almost 1,000x reduction. If we had not done these things, what the cost would have been compared to what it is today. And today, the training cost of all Google's energy usage is less than 15% is actually used in training, even at this scale. So we are working very hard. Obviously, it's not a solved problem, and the demand will only be increased, but these are the 4 dimensions which will keep pushing.
Right.
We'll do that.
I'm so sorry we've run out of time. I'm just going to end with one last question, Irene. The other big debate going on in this whole technological conundrum is the debate about closed systems owned by big corporates, massive concentration of knowledge, power, and wealth. And the other is the open source, you know, which has its own dilemmas because you're putting this extremely potent technology into the hands of the many with even less guardrails. It's hard enough controlling large corporates, but then imagine controlling like 7 billion people. Where do you sit? And because you are working clearly with an open source company, what are your arguments for an open source and closed source?
Well, I will also say that this question did take up several hours in the US Senate, but I will try to make this the last question. So part of why I'm excited to work on open source is it was a way for me to see incredible research happening in lower resource parts of the world and for people to have access to systems who maybe don't have that infrastructural access, meaning access to compute, or don't have the formal education or aren't close to that company. So when we're talking about what Eric was talking about, receiving that feedback, it's so important that people have access to your point, Shoma, about transparency and disclosure, not just open source models, but better transparency into how systems are built, better disclosure about risk evaluations, just makes for a healthy science ecosystem where we collectively can build more powerful models that serve all of us while balancing the risk. You talked about Sora. I have concerns about Sora. I have concerns about our information ecosystem and how much trust we can now have on information online. So it is a very difficult balance that we need regulation and we need collective action.
You know, you said something really important. I'd like to leave that as a thought amongst the many thoughts that have been expressed here. You said that, and I read a very interesting story about a woman in America who was denied housing by an AI system. And she, obviously with public policy, litigants and lawyers helping her, took it to court to ask what was the data set that prohibited her from getting housing. And it's important to know that what's the data, what's the feed going into this machine to be able to take decisions on our lives, which is between your getting a loan, housing. I'm not even going into the military applications or the big dangers and civilizational dangers, just the mundane. We need to know what's going into, because you can't talk to that machine, without knowing what its origin story and childhood wounds were, So it's great to know that you're also talking about this. And I'd like all of us to live with this one thought, that we have another speaker at Synapse who thinks that all of this is past tense. AI is passé. It's going to hit a wall because silicon is rigid and energy intensive, that the human brain is the best technology. And he and others are now working on a biological operating intelligence system which will take the brain out of the body and meld it into a machine, because that's going to be so much more energy efficient. So this is moving really fast, even at its infancy. Like Tom Friedman leaned into a Zoom call he and I were having, and he said, Shoma, did you think that we could hear each other whisper across the Atlantic 4 years ago? And that's a really sobering thought. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you.